Hey everyone, I'm Beth. I serve on the young adults team. I'm so excited to be hanging out with you all and sharing this message with you today. We're continuing our series on the book of Daniel, this sometimes weird, often confusing book written in multiple languages by multiple authors about the events happening to Daniel and his friends as they are held captive in Babylon in the first half, as well as some vision and prophecies of Daniel in the second half. If you haven't tuned into this series yet, make sure you go back, catch up on the first 4 sessions. Garrett does an awesome job kind of going in deeper into more detail on this time in history and the events of the first 4 chapters. But today, we're jumping into chapter 5, and I have to admit, I've never really gotten deep into chapter 5 before. I kind of skimmed over it in between the good parts about the fiery furnace or the lion's den, these good stories that we hear about in Sunday school or in Veggie Tales. But we're meeting a new character, yet another king, Belshazzar, who's caught in this cycle, this theme we see throughout the book of Daniel of men, kings trying to exalt themselves above God, of pride and arrogance and imperial power. And several times throughout this book, we see God using Daniel, who has a reputation of having an excellent spirit, to warn these rulers to turn from their ways, to humble themselves before the Lord, or else there'll be some undesirable consequences. But as we'll read today, the response and the character of these various kings differs greatly. And we can actually learn a lot through this text about what it takes to push our pride and our arrogance aside and focus on cultivating an excellent spirit and humility. We can be known for having an excellent spirit set apart, not for our glory, but for God's glory. I think especially during this season we're in, people are looking to us, followers of Jesus, to see how we're reacting to this new normal, to the fear, to uncertainty of the future. So what will they see when they look at us? What will we be known for during this time? Will people notice, hey, I know I have this friend of mine who has faith, maybe they can pray for me right now, or hey, my coworker goes to church, maybe I can ask them how I can watch online. Will we have a reputation of having an excellent spirit set apart from this world, who others can call on for help? So we're going to jump into chapter 5. It starts with King Belshazzar throwing this big party. Everyone's drinking wine. Things start to get crazy. Then Belshazzar commands they bring in all of the silver and the gold vessels that they had plundered from the temple in Jerusalem, and they sacrilegiously start drinking from those. They start worshiping all of these false gods. And then things get really crazy. Then it says that the fingers of a human hand appear and start writing on the wall. Now, understandably, Belshazzar freaks out. He's terrified and so confused because not only is there this random hand writing on the wall, but he can't understand what the writing says. So he calls for all his enchanters and astrologers to come try to figure out what it says. He says that whoever can tell him what it means will receive a purple robe, a chain of gold, and will be made the 3rd highest ruler in the kingdom. But of course, none of his wise men could tell him what it means. So enter the queen. Picking up in verse 10, it says this: The queen, because of the words of the king and his lords, came into the banqueting hall, and the queen declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers. Because an excellent spirit, knowledge and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. So Daniel is brought before Belshazzar, and he's asked to interpret the writing, again with this promise of if you can do it, you'll be made 3rd highest in the kingdom. Daniel answers like this in verse 17. He says, Let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king, and make known to him the interpretation. But before he delivers this interpretation, he goes on to recount everything that happened to King Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 4, how he too was filled with pride and arrogance and exalted himself before God, driven out like a beast in the fields. But then he looks up to heaven, starts to honor and worship God. So he's restored to his throne even greater than before. And Daniel's calling Belshazzar out a little bit here. He's saying, hey, you knew this history, you knew what happened to your father, but you still haven't humbled your heart. So he goes on to interpret the writing in chapter 25. It says this, and this is the writing that was inscribed. Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple, and a chain of gold was put around his neck. And a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Okay, so there's a lot of crazy things happening here, but from this text, we see that Daniel had a pretty good reputation. He was known for having an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding. He was set apart, sought after, and elevated because he was obedient in using these gifts. And I think that from this text, we can gather a few key ways that we can cultivate an excellent spirit like Daniel. And the first point is this: excellent through our work. Colossians 3:23 says, work willingly at whatever you do, as though you were working for the Lord rather than for people. Daniel wasn't interpreting all these dreams for these kings who had conquered him and his people and taken them captive for their sake. It wasn't just another cool party trick amongst the other enchanters and astrologers. He wasn't doing it for the glory. He actually said, no, I don't want your gifts, but I'll still interpret it for you. He was doing it for God. Because even to these pagan kings, God was showing mercy and compassion and giving second and third chances to. And Daniel, using his gifts of prophecy, of interpretation, and wisdom, this was an act of honoring God, not just doing a favor for man. There was an eternal importance to Daniel's gift and the reason that he was set apart. And because he was obedient with the gifts God gave him, God elevated him from being a slave to being third in the entire kingdom. Part of having this excellent spirit is being faithful in what's been assigned to us in this season, and doing work as if it was for God and not for man. Maybe right now you're like, what even is work? Maybe during this time of quarantine you found yourself out of work, so how does this excellence in our work even apply right now? Well, it doesn't have to be about your literal job or career. It could be staying home with your family or kids right now. It could be getting groceries for your grandparents or putting some encouraging thoughts out there on Instagram. It could be being diligent in praying for others, or maybe sewing masks for your neighbors. But whatever it is, do it willingly with excellence for God's glory and not your own. You never know when God's going to use your role for a much greater purpose. Maybe you've been stocking shelves at the grocery store, and now all of a sudden you're an actual hero. Keep doing that willingly and with excellence and for God's glory. What position or gifts has God entrusted with you? When you put those to use, not for your glory, but for God's, He will use that. People will notice that, something different about you. You will be set apart by your excellent spirit. And the second point is this: excellence through being teachable. This is about learning from the past and being willing to grow and develop godly character over time. Our past informs who we are, but it doesn't define who we are if we're willing to learn and change from our prideful ways. Last week we saw King Nebuchadnezzar in a very similar situation as Belshazzar. He too was exalting himself above God, full of pride and arrogance. He didn't heed Daniel's prophetic warning, and he suffered for a time, but then something changed. He looked to heaven, praised the Most High, honored and glorified God, and he was reestablished to his throne even greater than before. But Belshazzar, he just didn't learn from his family's history. Belshazzar continues to pridefully and arrogantly dishonor God, desecrate vessels from the temple, relish in drunkenness, and worshiping false gods. And Daniel starts to get a little snippy here. He's losing patience. He's saying, how many times do I have to warn you people? You haven't humbled your heart yet, even though you knew better. Belshazzar failed to learn from the past. He failed to respond to any of the times God showed mercy and compassion, and the consequences of his pride and arrogance was in that writing on the wall. He was assassinated, and his kingdom, the very source of his pride, was divided. We see that Daniel, though, has grown and developed from his past, and his excellent spirit and godly character has developed even greater since the start of this book when he was first taken into captivity. So what will we learn from our past and from the past of those who have gone before us? Will we take God's grace and mercy for granted and get stuck in this cycle of sin and pain and disappointment? Or will we grow in wisdom and discernment, renewing our minds in the Word, cultivating an excellent spirit within us? We have to be willing to be teachable, to admit when we're wrong, learn from the past, turn from our sin, and turn towards God. My third and final point is this: excellence through humility. Pride and arrogance and exalting oneself over God is the big theme of the book of Daniel. It's the downfall of powerful kings, and it still causes so much grief and heartache and pain in our lives today. And in order to have an excellent spirit, we have to practice humility. I love how Jackie Hill Perry, who's a Bible teacher, author, poet, I love how she describes humility. She says, "Humility is just agreeing with reality. And the reality is, I'm a created thing. The reality is, I'm subject to someone who is much more authoritative than me. Someone whose sandals I don't have the right to touch. Someone who is worshipped by angels. Someone who can make the rocks cry out. And so when I consider the grandness of God, in reality, I'm not him. Because pride and arrogance is my attempt to assert or project a kind of self that doesn't really exist. I am not as awesome as I think I am. I am not as all-knowing as I would like to be. I am not as wise as people might comment and say that I am. And that's okay to be limited, because I serve a God who is limitless. We are the created thing, not the creator. Our sinful nature tries to flip that on its head, but by trying to exalt ourselves over God, we're ignoring the reality that there's a specific order to things. And when we get things out of order, God will correct that. In the book of Daniel, we see all these kings who exalted themselves ended up losing everything. But Daniel, and eventually King Nebuchadnezzar, humbled themselves before the Lord, and he elevated them. Even Jesus, the Son of God, humbled himself. Philippians 2:8 says, "And being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross." If we are to have an excellent spirit, we need to humble ourselves to God and be willing to obediently serve him and others. The reason we would even want an excellent spirit or want to be set apart is ultimately to serve God and to serve others with the gifts that God's given us. It can inform every aspect of our lives, from our career and family to how we are navigating tough seasons like this one, to how we respond to someone when they reach out to us for help. I want to close today with a few questions for you to think about this week. What will we be known for during this time? Will we work for the Lord? Will we be willing to be teachable and learn from the past? Will we practice humility? Will we have a reputation that sets us apart, not for our own glory, but for God's glory and to serve others? Will we be open to letting God teach us something in this season and cultivate an excellent spirit within us? Hey, thanks so much for joining us this week. Share this video with a friend. Join us next week for our 6th and final week of our study on the book of Daniel. I miss you all. Have a great week. Bye.